Did you ever wonder if medieval romance was just about knights, dragons, and damsels? What if every single flicker of love, every whispered secret, and every grand gesture from 500 CE to 1500 CE was under the watchful eye of something much bigger than a king? Number 8. The Church's takeover of marriage. Before the powerful hand of the Church fully shaped European society, marriage often operated on a different set of rules. Local customs, family agreements, and tribal traditions usually dictated how people formed unions. A marriage might be sealed with a handshake, a communal feast, or simply by a couple living together and being recognized by their community. Dowries and bride prices were common, signifying the economic exchange and the shifting of alliances between families. The emphasis was often on practical matters: land, lineage, political power, and the production of legitimate heirs. These were not inherently spiritual unions in the way they would later become. For example, Germanic law traditions often viewed marriage as a contractual arrangement between a man and a woman and their respective families, focusing on property, transfer, and legal standing rather than spiritual sanctity. A simple agreement, often followed by cohabitation, could constitute a valid marriage in many places for centuries. However, as the Church's influence grew, especially from the 11th century onwards, it began to assert its authority over every aspect of daily life, and marriage was no exception. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 CE marked a pivotal moment. This council formally declared marriage a sacrament, placing it firmly under the Church's jurisdiction. This was a revolutionary shift, transformed marriage from a largely secular, customary affair into a sacred divine institution, one that reflected the union of Christ and the Church. This move meant that the Church, and not just local lords or families, had the ultimate say on who could marry, when, and how. Priest, acting as God's representative, became an essential part of the ceremony, blessing the union and officiating the vows. The blessing of the priest and the public declaration of vows, ideally before the church door, became the proper way to signify a legitimate union in the eyes of God and the community. A key element introduced by the Church was the concept of consent. For a marriage to be valid, both parties, a man and a woman, had to freely consent to the union. This might seem progressive, but this consent was still within specific parameters set by the Church. It was not about romantic love in the modern sense, but a spiritual acceptance of the marital bond. The influential canon lawyer Gratian, whose decretals compiled around 1140 CE, became a foundational text for canon law, emphasized the dual importance of consent and consummation. While consent made the marriage valid in law, consummation made it indissoluble. This indissolubility was another cornerstone of the Church's control. Once validly contracted and consummated, a marriage could not be dissolved by human will. Divorce, as it is understood today, was impossible. Annulments were the only way out, granted only under very specific and rare circumstances, such as pre-existing, undisclosed impediments like too close kinship or a prior unconsummated vow. This meant people were bound for life, drastically shaping their romantic possibilities and future security. The Church also enforced strict rules regarding who could marry whom. Prohibited degrees of kinship were extensive, far beyond what modern societies consider incestuous. Marrying someone related to you even by a distant cousin, or even by a spiritual bond, like godparents marrying their godchildren, was forbidden. These rules, often extended to the seventh degree of kinship, served to prevent powerful families from consolidating too much wealth and influence through intermarriage, but also to reinforce the Church's authority over social networks. Breaking these rules could lead to excommunication, the ultimate spiritual punishment, and the invalidation of the marriage, rendering any children illegitimate. Consequences were dire, impacting social standing, inheritance, and eternal salvation. Famous example illustrating the complexities of consent and church authority is the story of Heloise and Abelard in the 12th century. They secretly married, a union driven by intellect and passion, yet it was not sanctioned publicly. Abelard's decision to conceal the marriage, ironically meant to protect his clerical career, ultimately caused much suffering and church intervention, highlighting the precarious position of unions not fully aligned with church regulations. Their story showcases the tension between personal desire and the rigid framework of ecclesiastical law. The church's insistence on public vows and priestly blessing meant that any clandestine marriage, no matter how heartfelt, stood on shaky ground. The overall impact of the church's takeover of marriage was profound. It dictated legitimacy, inheritance, and social acceptance. Children born outside of a church-sanctioned marriage were considered illegitimate, often denied inheritance rights and carrying a social stigma. This placed immense pressure on individuals to conform to the church's regulations, not just for their own salvation, but for the future of their lineage. Church became the ultimate arbiter of family formation, directly controlling who could partner, how, and for how long, embedding its authority deeply into the fabric of medieval romance, shaping its very definition. The legal ramifications alone were immense, with church courts handling marital disputes further solidifying the institution's pervasive oversight. Every marriage, from peasant to king, was now a matter of divine ordinance, a public declaration of faith as much as a private bond. Number 7. Courtly love and the Holy Mother. Courtly love, a concept that blossomed in the noble courts of France and Aquitaine around the 11th and 12th centuries, seems at first glance to be a purely secular, even rebellious form of romance. It was often characterized by a knight's intense, idealized devotion to a married noblewoman, usually his social superior. This love was typically unconsummated, secretive, and involved a long period of service and suffering by the knight to prove his worthiness. The lady was seen as a source of inspiration, virtue, and nobility, and the knight's service to her often spurred him to heroic deeds, refined manners, and moral self-improvement. Troubadours, the lyrical poets and musicians of the time, often sang of this type of love, creating complex poetic forms to express profound longing and admiration for their unattainable ladies. The very idea of an aristocratic knight dedicating his life to a lady, often not his wife, appeared to challenge societal norms and traditional marital structures. However, the powerful shadow of the church and its profound influence on spiritual devotion cast a surprising light on the very nature of courtly love. Many scholars have pointed to a striking parallel between the adoration of the knight for his lady and the intense veneration of the Virgin Mary, the Holy Mother, which was growing exponentially during the same period. Cults of the Virgin Mary became a central pillar of medieval piety. She was seen as pure, immaculate, compassionate, and the ultimate intercessor between humanity and God. Knights, in particular, often swore oaths in her name, invoked her protection in battle, and saw her as the epitome of spiritual perfection. Her image adorned cathedrals, stained glass windows, and personal devotional objects, creating a pervasive visual and spiritual presence throughout medieval life. The similarities are compelling. The lady in courtly love was often portrayed as impossibly beautiful, virtuous, and beyond reproach, much like the Divine Mary. The knight's devotion was selfless, involving constant service, humility, and suffering for his lady's approval, mirroring the devout Christian's lifelong striving for Mary's favor and salvation. The unconsummated nature of much courtly love also resonated with the spiritual purity associated with Mary, who remained a virgin despite being a mother. This spiritual purity, this idea of love, elevated beyond the physical, found a ready template in Marian devotion. A knight might praise his lady in terms that could almost be applied to the Virgin Mary, her beauty, her grace, her ability to inspire virtue. The love was not meant to be base or carnal, but to elevate the lover to a higher moral and spiritual plane. Consider the narrative of Lancelot and Guinevere in Chrétien de Troyes' Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart. Lancelot's devotion to Queen Guinevere is absolute and all-consuming. He undertakes perilous quests, endures humiliation, and sacrifices his own reputation, all for a mere glance or word from her. His service to her is not merely a secular pledge. It takes on a devotional quality, almost a religious fervor. He literally debases himself for her, stepping into a cart meant for criminals to follow her, an act considered deeply dishonorable for a knight. Yet, for Guinevere, he does it. His love for her inspires his greatest acts of chivalry. But it is also a source of great personal torment, much like a sinner striving for grace from a divine power. The narrative highlights the intense spiritualization of this otherwise illicit love. His worship of her echoes the reverence for a saint or the Virgin Mary, where the beloved becomes a conduit for grace and a standard for moral conduct. Troubadour poetry further illustrates this connection. Many poems used religious imagery to describe earthly love. The lady's beauty might be described as divine, her presence a blessing, and her words a form of salvation. The suffering endured by the lover, the intense longing, and the humility displayed were all characteristics found in devotional literature. The lady, though human, became an almost sacred object of veneration. This paradoxical blending of the sacred and the profane allowed for the expression of intense, often transgressive, romantic feelings within a framework that subtly justified them through spiritual parallels. It was a way for the very human desire for profound connection and idealization to find expression without completely abandoning the deeply ingrained religious sensibilities of the time. The Church's emphasis on spiritual devotion and the widespread veneration of Mary thus provided a powerful, if sometimes subconscious, blueprint for the ideals and expressions of courtly love, shaping how knights and ladies understood and pursued romantic devotion. This connection meant that even in what seemed like independent expressions of love, the shadow of religious ideals was always present, subtly guiding or even justifying the most passionate of attachments. Knights, crusades, and holy war romance. The image of the medieval knight is almost inseparable from the ideals of chivalry, bravery, honor, loyalty, and courtesy. But woven deeply into this tapestry of valor was a profound religious dimension. The Church played a pivotal role in shaping the very definition of knighthood, transforming what might have been mere warriors into Christian soldiers dedicated to God and the protection of Christendom. This transformation significantly influenced the role of romance in a knight's life, intertwining his devotion to a lady with his sacred duties. From the 10th century onwards, the Church actively sought to curb the rampant violence among the feudal aristocracy. It introduced concepts like the peace of God and the truce of God, which aimed to limit fighting and protect non-combatants. More importantly, it channeled the martial energies of the nobility towards sanctioned righteous violence, the Crusades. Beginning in 1095 CE with Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade, the Church offered spiritual rewards, including indulgences and the promise of salvation to those who took up the cross and fought to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. This was not merely a military campaign, it was a holy war, a pilgrimage, and a spiritual penance all rolled into one. Knights who embarked on crusades were not just fighting for land or glory. They were fighting for God. Their swords were consecrated, their banners blessed, and their actions framed as divine service. End quote. This religious imperative deeply impacted the knightly ideal. Loyalty to God, the Church, and Christian ideals became paramount. A knight's prowess on the battlefield was increasingly seen as a reflection of his piety and moral standing. This concept of the Miles Christi, or soldier of Christ, meant that a knight's entire being, including his romantic life, was filtered through a religious lens. The lady in a knight's life became intertwined with these sacred duties. While a knight might swear fealty to his lord and his God, his devotion to his lady could also be framed in a surprisingly religious context. Serving his lady, protecting her honor, or undertaking quests for her could be seen as parallel to serving God. Purity and virtue attributed to the lady, often echoing the ideals of the Virgin Mary, meant that a knight's pursuit of her favor could be interpreted as a noble, even spiritual endeavor. His deeds of arms performed for her sake were not just secular acts of prowess, but could also be seen as demonstrations of his refined character, reflecting his moral and spiritual worth, a worth that was enhanced by his dedication to the Church. Consider the narratives of Arthurian romance. Knights like Sir Lancelot, Sir Percival, or Sir Galahad perform extraordinary feats of bravery and undertake perilous journeys. While often motivated by their love for a lady or their loyalty to King Arthur, their quests frequently have a strong spiritual dimension. The Grail quest, for instance, is the ultimate spiritual journey, requiring purity of heart and adherence to Christian virtues. A knight's success in such a quest directly depended on his spiritual cleanliness, his avoidance of sin, and his devotion to God. Even in the pursuit of a lady, a knight's actions were expected to uphold certain moral standards. He might fight for his lady's honor, defend the innocent, or right wrongs, all actions that aligned with Christian precepts of justice and charity. The ideal knight was not only strong and brave, but also pious and virtuous. Historical crusaders also carried this dual motivation. They left their homes and families, often enduring immense hardship, driven by a complex mix of religious fervor, land hunger, and a desire for glory. But even in the midst of brutal warfare, the ideal of the lady often remained. A knight might carry a token from his beloved, fight harder to prove himself worthy of her, or dedicate his victories to her name. The service to the cross and the service to the lady became symbolically linked, both requiring immense sacrifice, unwavering loyalty, and a pursuit of an ideal that transcended immediate gratification. Crusader's vow to God was a solemn oath, and his commitment to his lady could be seen as a parallel vow of loyalty and devotion, reflecting the same depth of character and spiritual resolve. Tales of knights who returned from crusades with enhanced reputations, not just as warriors but as men of God, often found themselves more desirable in the eyes of noblewomen, further cementing the connection between religious service and romantic allure. The Church's shaping of the knightly order into a spiritual force therefore indirectly yet powerfully defined the romantic aspirations and expressions of medieval chivalry. The ultimate validation for a knight was not just his prowess in battle, but his spiritual standing and his ability to serve both his earthly lord. Number 5. The deadly sin of lust. The medieval Church wielded immense power over the moral lives of individuals, and its teachings on sin were absolute. Among the 7 deadly sins, lust stood out as a particularly dangerous transgression, directly impacting the very definition of romance and desire. For the Church, any sexual activity outside the confines of a church-sanctioned, procreative marriage was considered sinful. This doctrine profoundly shaped how medieval people understood and expressed romantic and sexual desires, often pushing them into secretive or condemned spaces. Lust, or luxuria in Latin, was defined not just as physical sexual desire, but as an uncontrolled and excessive longing for illicit pleasure. It was seen as a grave threat to the soul, capable of leading one away from God and towards eternal damnation. This wasn't merely a suggestion, it was a core theological tenet, reinforced through sermons, confessional practices, and widespread moral literature. Clerics relentlessly preached against illicit sexual relations, condemning fornication, sex outside marriage, adultery, sex with someone else's spouse, and sodomy, non-procreative sexual acts. These acts were not just social taboos. They were direct offenses against God and punishable by spiritual and sometimes secular law. The fear of hellfire and eternal punishment was a very real deterrent for medieval people. The Church taught that every sin, including lust, required confession and penance to achieve salvation. Confessional booth became a powerful tool for moral policing, where individuals were compelled to reveal their innermost thoughts and actions to a priest. Priest, acting as God's representative, would then offer absolution after assigning specific penances which could range from prayers and fasts to pilgrimages. This constant self-scrutiny and the need to confess sins meant that any romantic inclinations that veered from the Church's strict doctrines were immediately flagged as dangerous. A man desiring a woman who was not his wife, or a woman harboring illicit thoughts, would be expected to confess these inclinations. The very act of desiring someone outside of a lawful, procreative marriage was often considered a sin of thought, even if no physical act occurred. Medieval romances, while often depicting passionate love affairs, frequently contained implicit or explicit warnings about the consequences of succumbing to lust. The tragic endings of many famous love stories can be seen through this lens. Consider the story of Tristan and Isolde. Their love, born from a magic potion, is portrayed as irresistible, but it is also an adulterous union, a violation of the sacred bonds of marriage between Isolde and King Mark. Their tragic fates, often culminating in death, can be interpreted as the inevitable consequence of their sinful love despite its passionate intensity. Their love story, while compelling, ultimately demonstrates the destructive power of a love that violates divine law. The inherent conflict between their personal desires and the societal expectation enforced by the Church ultimately leads to their downfall. Church's condemnation of lust also impacted social structures. Prostitution, while often tolerated as a necessary evil in certain urban areas to contain male lust, was still considered sinful. Children born from illicit unions were stigmatized as illegitimate, affecting their inheritance rights and social standing. The pervasive influence of this doctrine meant that even courtship rituals were carefully navigated. Public displays of affection were often limited, and social gatherings where men and women interacted were often chaperoned or took place within a framework that emphasized appropriate behavior. Pursuit of love had to either fit within the Church's very narrow definition of acceptable union or be conducted in secrecy under the constant threat of spiritual damnation. This pervasive fear and constant vigilance against the sin of lust cast a long shadow over every aspect of medieval romance. It meant that true romantic fulfillment, as understood in a modern context, was often curtailed or redefined. Love, if it was to be pure and acceptable, had to be chaste before marriage and purely procreative within it. Any deviation was a spiritual battlefield, a constant struggle against temptation, where the fear of God's judgment was a very real, very personal deterrent. The Church's teachings ensured that the pursuit of romantic desire was not just a matter of personal choice, but a matter of eternal salvation, thereby controlling the very boundaries of passion itself. Number 4. Forbidden love and divine judgment. The Church's authority in medieval Europe was not merely spiritual. It had very real, tangible consequences for those who dared to defy its doctrines, especially concerning matters of love and marriage. When romance ventured outside the Church's rigid rules, the punishments could be severe, ranging from social ostracization to excommunication, and even, in some cases, the ultimate condemnation as heresy. This direct intervention demonstrated the Church's unwavering grip on romantic possibilities. One of the most immediate and habile forms of punishment was social and spiritual censure. If a couple entered into a union that was deemed invalid by the Church, for example, due to too close kinship, a pre-existing vow, or an unfulfilled contract, their marriage could be declared null. This meant that the couple was living in sin. Their children were considered illegitimate, and they faced immense pressure from the community and the clergy to separate. Public shaming, exclusion from community life, and constant moral pressure were common tools used to bring individuals back into line with church law. The inability to receive sacraments, such as communion or last rites, also carried immense weight for deeply religious medieval people, instilling a profound fear of dying outside the grace of God. Excommunication was the most dreaded spiritual penalty. It was a formal exclusion from the Christian community, meaning the excommunicated person was denied all sacraments, could not be buried in consecrated ground, and was effectively cut off from salvation. For a medieval person, whose entire social and spiritual world revolved around the Church, this was a devastating blow. It stripped them of their identity, their community, and their hope for an afterlife. King could even be deposed if excommunicated, as his subjects might be released from their oaths of fealty. If a powerful lord or lady engaged in a forbidden romantic relationship, their excommunication could cause widespread political instability, demonstrating the Church's immense leverage. For instance, King Philip I of France was excommunicated for his bigamous marriage to Bertrade de Montfort in the late 11th century. This excommunication caused significant political turmoil and disrupted religious life in his realm, as Mass could not be said and other sacraments were suspended, showing the very real power of this spiritual sanction on secular rulers and their romantic choices. Beyond annulments and excommunication, the Church also prosecuted cases related to sexual morality in its own courts. Adultery, fornication, and other sexual sins were not just spiritual offenses. They were legal matters handled by ecclesiastical courts, which could impose fines, public penance, or even imprisonment in church facilities. These courts served as a powerful mechanism for enforcing moral conformity and ensuring that romantic relationships adhered to strict Christian norms. The detailed records of these courts show countless instances of individuals being brought to justice for various sexual misdeeds, demonstrating the meticulous oversight the Church maintained over personal relationships. In more extreme cases, unconventional forms of love or sexual expression could be linked to heresy. While not directly romantic in the modern sense, any deviation from established church doctrine, including those related to sexuality, could be branded as heretical. For example, some dualist heretical movements, like the Cathars in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, held different views on marriage and procreation, sometimes rejecting marriage entirely or advocating for practices considered abhorrent by the Catholic Church. These alternative views on relationships, seen as a direct challenge to the Church's authority and theological understanding of creation and salvation, were met with brutal suppression, including crusades and the Inquisition. The very existence of such alternative views, however briefly, highlights the Church's struggle to maintain total control over romantic and sexual expression. The Albigensian Crusade was launched against the Cathars, leading to massacres and the destruction of an entire culture, partly due to their distinct theological perspectives, including their views on marriage and procreation. This shows the ultimate brutal consequence of differing with the Church on such fundamental issues. The Church's judgment cast a long shadow over every romantic decision. It instilled a deep-seated fear of defying divine will and facing earthly retribution. Love, therefore, was not a free-flowing emotion in the medieval world, but a closely regulated sphere where the cost of transgression could be astronomical. This constant threat of divine judgment meant that individuals navigated their romantic lives with an acute awareness of the Church's watchful eye, either conforming to its dictates or risking devastating personal and spiritual consequences. The power of the Church to define sin, impose penance, and inflict excommunication effectively controlled the boundaries of acceptable love, ensuring that most romantic narratives, even those that explored forbidden love, ultimately reinforced. Number 3. The call of celibacy. V.S. Earthly desire. Amidst the swirling currents of medieval romance and the pursuit of earthly love, the Church presented a powerful, even radical alternative: the call to celibacy. This was not merely a personal choice, but a celebrated ideal, often presented as the highest form of spiritual devotion, creating a profound tension with worldly desires and romantic attachments. The promotion of monasticism and the celibate priesthood served as a constant looming counter-narrative to the siren call of earthly passion, shaping how people viewed, pursued, and sometimes even rejected romance. From the early days of Christianity, celibacy and virginity were lauded as superior states of spiritual purity, reflecting a complete dedication to God. This ideal was codified in monastic orders, where monks and nuns took solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing all worldly possessions, familial ties, and romantic or sexual relationship. Monasteries and convents became powerful centers of spiritual life, learning, and economic activity, attracting thousands of individuals from all social classes. For many, entering a monastery or convent was a profound spiritual commitment, a way to escape the temptations of the world and devote oneself entirely to prayer and contemplation. It was considered a heroic act, a sacrifice of worldly pleasure for eternal salvation. The celibacy of the clergy also became increasingly enforced, especially from the 11th century onwards, reaching a peak with the Gregorian reforms. Prior to this, many priests and even bishops had wives and children, but the Church sought to distinguish its clergy from the laity and to prevent church property from being inherited by clerical families. The ideal of a celibate priesthood presented priests as living embodiments of spiritual purity, consecrated entirely to God's service and unburdened by worldly attachments. This meant that the most visible representatives of the Church, those who administered the sacraments, heard confessions, and preached, were living examples of a life without marriage or earthly romance. Their existence served as a constant reminder that human desire was secondary to divine devotion. This emphasis on celibacy created a significant tension with the natural human inclination towards romantic love and procreation. While marriage was a sacrament and necessary for the continuation of society, it was still considered a lesser state than celibacy. St. Paul's teachings found in the New Testament had already set a precedent by suggesting that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and that those who can remain unmarried should do so, while marriage was advised for those who could not control their desires, so that they might avoid fornication, this theoleval thought. So, while romantic love might be celebrated in certain literary forms, it was always understood within the larger context of a church that held spiritual celibacy as the highest form of human striving. This tension played out in countless individual lives and in the narratives of medieval romance. Many characters in literature, particularly those embarking on spiritual quests, found themselves faced with a choice between earthly love and divine service. Sir Galahad, in the Arthurian legends, for example, is the epitome of the pure knight, destined to achieve the Holy Grail. His purity is inextricably linked to his virginity, and his complete devotion to God setting him apart from other knights who might be entangled in worldly romantic affairs. His success in the Grail quest is attributed to his freedom from earthly attachments, a stark contrast to characters like Lancelot, whose adulterous love for Guinevere, despite his chivalric virtues, ultimately prevents him from achieving the Grail. This narrative directly reinforces the Church's ideal of celibacy as a path to spiritual perfection. Moreover, noble families often sent younger children, especially daughters, to convents not just for religious devotion, but also for education, security, or as a way to avoid dividing inheritances. For these individuals, the life of a nun meant renouncing any possibility of marriage or romantic love, trading earthly companionship for spiritual communion. This was a direct choice, often made or enforced, that curtailed romantic destinies for thousands of individuals throughout the medieval period. Call to celibacy, therefore, stood as a powerful, ever-present alternative to the pursuit of earthly romance. It was a life path sanctioned and celebrated by the Church, providing a stark reminder that true love, in the eyes of God, was ultimately spiritual and free from the entanglements of human desire. This profound spiritual ideal thus controlled the very boundaries of romantic possibility for both the clergy and the laity by presenting a morally superior alternative to marriage and family. Number 2. The saints who knew best. Or so they said. In the medieval world, saints were not just historical figures. They were living examples, spiritual guides, and powerful intercessors. Their lives, narratives, and miraculous deeds permeated every aspect of daily existence, including the ideals and expressions of romance. The Church used the stories of saints to transmit moral lessons, enforce virtues, and provide templates for pure conduct, which often stood in stark contrast to the passionate, often transgressive, themes of secular romance. The saints, particularly the Virgin Mary and virgin martyrs, offered models of purity, sacrifice, and divine devotion that profoundly shaped romantic ideals. The cult of saints was immensely popular throughout the Middle Ages. Every town, profession, and indeed almost every individual had a patron saint. Pilgrimages to shrines, veneration of relics, and participation in saintly feast days were central to medieval piety. The lives of saints were read aloud, depicted in art, and performed in plays, making their stories widely accessible to people of all social strata. These narratives were carefully carbuted by the Church to promote specific virtues and reinforce doctrinal teachings. For romance, the most influential saints were often those who exemplified chastity, martyrdom, or unwavering devotion to God above all earthly attachments. The Virgin Mary stands as the preeminent example. Her status as both a virgin and a mother made her a unique and powerful figure of veneration. She embodied purity, humility, compassion, and divine grace. As discussed earlier, her idealized image often influenced the courtly love tradition, where the knight's devotion to his lady mirrored the spiritual reverence for Mary. But beyond this, Mary's purity served as a direct model for women. A woman's virtue, her chastity before marriage and her fidelity within it, were often directly compared to Mary's immaculate state. Her life represented the ultimate ideal of female piety, providing a moral compass for personal conduct, including romantic relationships. Virgin martyrs, such as Saint Agnes, Saint Cecilia, and Saint Catherine of Alexandria, offered even more dramatic examples of purity and devotion triumphing over earthly temptation. These were young women who, often faced with forced marriages or sexual assault by pagan rulers, chose to die rather than renounce their faith or compromise their virginity. Their stories were incredibly popular, emphasizing the supreme value of spiritual purity over physical life. They depicted a heroic struggle against worldly desires and external pressures, where their devotion to Christ was stronger than any earthly bond, including romantic ones. The narrative of Saint Agnes, for instance, tells of her refusal to marry a pagan suitor, choosing Christ as her only spouse, and ultimately suffering martyrdom. Her story, widely circulated, glorified the renunciation of earthly marriage for a spiritual one, implicitly warning against the dangers of prioritizing worldly affection over divine love. These narratives served as a powerful counter-narrative to romantic love that focused on physical attraction or social alliance. They suggested that the most profound and worthy love was reserved for God alone, and that true spiritual fulfillment might require the ultimate sacrifice of earthly desire. Male saints, though often not celebrated for their virginity in the same way, also provided models of devotion that overshadowed romantic attachments. Saints like Francis of Assisi, who embraced a life of poverty and self-denial, or Bernard of Clairvaux, a strict ascetic and influential monastic leader, demonstrated that a life dedicated to God involved renouncing worldly pleasures and earthly bonds. Their stories highlighted the superior merit of spiritual love, emphasizing that true devotion was found not in human relationships, but in an unshakable bond with the divine. The very concept of a spiritual marriage between a nun and Christ, where the nun became a bride of Christ, further reinforced the Church's preference for divine love over earthly love. This imagery, deeply embedded in monastic life and mystical literature, positioned spiritual union as the ultimate romantic ideal, a complete surrender of self to God. Therefore, the lives and legends of the saints were not merely historical accounts. They were powerful moral lessons and aspirational blueprints for how to live a truly Christian life. By touting purity, sacrifice, and ultimate devotion to God, they subtly yet profoundly controlled the narrative of medieval romance, setting an almost unattainable standard for virtuous love and constantly reminding individuals that their ultimate allegiance and their purest love belonged to the divine. Number 1. The Church calendar's grip on courtship. It might seem strange to think of a calendar controlling who you meet and when you might fall in love. But in medieval Europe, the Church's liturgical calendar held an immense sway over daily life, dictating everything from work schedules to social gatherings, and by extension, subtly yet powerfully shaping the very opportunities for courtship and the expression of romance. Every day, every week, and every season was marked by religious observances, fasts, and feast days, creating a rhythm of life that left little room for independent romantic pursuits. The medieval year was structured around the major Christian holidays. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and numerous saints' feast days punctuated the agricultural cycle and the social calendar. During these feast days, work might cease, and communities would gather for religious services, processions, and sometimes communal celebrations. These gatherings, while primarily religious, were often the most significant opportunities for young men and women from different families or villages to interact. A village fair on a saint's day, a pilgrimage to a local shrine, or a communal feast after Mass could provide rare chances for eye contact, conversation, and the subtle beginnings of courtship. The Church thus in effect controlled the very timing and context of social interaction that could lead to romantic connections. Without these specific religious events, the structured and often isolated nature of medieval rural life offered fewer informal opportunities for meeting potential partners. Conversely, the Church calendar also imposed strict periods of abstinence and solemnity, which directly curtailed romantic and sexual activities. Lent, the 40-day period leading up to Easter, was a time of fasting, penance, and reflection. During Lent, marriages were typically forbidden, and any form of revelry or excessive celebration was frowned upon. Similarly, Advent, the period leading up to Christmas, was another time of spiritual preparation and restraint, where solemnity replaced festive cheer. These periods of fasting and spiritual discipline were rigorously enforced, not just by religious decree, but often by social custom and peer pressure. Engaging in boisterous parties, dances, or overtly romantic overtures during these sacred times would have been seen as disrespectful and even sinful, reflecting poorly on one's piety. Beyond these major periods, many individual days and vigils were also designated as times of fasting or abstinence. Fridays in particular were often observed as days of penance, commemorating the crucifixion of Christ. Even specific saints' days could carry local prohibitions against certain activities. This constant ebb and flow of religious obligation meant that people were continually reminded of their spiritual duties, which often superseded their personal desires. A young man or woman might be discouraged from attending a social gathering if it fell on a holy day of obligation that required church attendance, or if it coincided with a period of fasting that precluded feasting and merrymaking. The church's influence extended to the very rituals of marriage itself. Marriages were almost never performed during Lent or Advent, reinforcing the sacred solemnity of these seasons. Preferred times for weddings were often after Easter, during the summer months, or in the autumn before Advent, coinciding with periods of greater communal festivity and agricultural abundance. This also meant that periods of intense courtship and engagement often had to align with these permissible windows, ensuring that the rhythm of romance followed the rhythm of the church. Timing of marriage itself was also often dictated by the liturgical calendar, ensuring a constant alignment between personal unions and the spiritual rhythm of the year. The church calendar also provided a framework for seasonal festivals that had their roots in both Christian and older pagan traditions, but which the church had assimilated and reinterpreted. May Day celebrations, for instance, involved dancing and revelry, and while often condemned by stricter church authorities for their pagan undertones, they still provided opportunities for courtship. However, even these activities were typically monitored and framed within a context that, theoretically, aligned with Christian morality. The sheer omnipresence of the church's calendar meant that every aspect of daily life, including the quiet, personal unfolding of romantic interests, was under its pervasive, invisible control. The church did not just set the rules for marriage, it set the very stage for when and where love could even begin to bloom, ensuring its authority permeated every romantic encounter from the first glance to the final vow.